So very briefly, I'm not going to speak to the safety issue because there are better people who are way better qualified than I am. But I think the example of openly advertising is interesting because if GM food were labelled clearly, I mean, actually proudly, you know, if this stuff is really as good as some people think it is, then it shouldn't be, you know, creeping into the food supply. It should actually be, you know, banner labelled, look at my wonderful GM crop, and then put it to the market and see what happens. But interestingly, that isn't typically what advocates argue. Now, as for whether or not it's bad for mice or causes food allergies, other people are much better capable of speaking to them.
GM food is labelled in Australia. There is a statutory requirement for labelling of GM ingredients. So, you know, the problem is that it's in there on that small label and you need your magnifying glass to find it along with all of the other things that are on the label. So, you know, there is labelling out there. Yeah, I'm sorry, I've forgotten what the rest of the question was.
The safety.
The safety. Look, so the point I made earlier on, there was this, the Europeans have done the most comprehensive study. And, you know, I'd refer you to that document, the website from the European Union. And I think scientifically there really is no reason to suppose there's any human health or safety issues associated with GM foods per se because of the technology. But I think, you know, going back to the point, that doesn't mean that there isn't a need for some level of scrutiny. And really going back to the other question that Tony raised earlier on about the regulation of the product, the Canadian GM regulation is actually, or food regulation, is actually based around the product. They regulate the product, they assay the product, they don't care how you get there, but they want to look at what you've done. And if you've used any new technology, they want to look at what you've done, what the product looks like, they want an analysis of that to show that it's safe, which I think is actually a good way of making decisions about what is safe and what isn't. Far better than, you know, this fixation on a particular methodology that we seem to have here.
But are there in fact any GM allergies? It seems to be very unlikely that anybody would become allergic to GM food.
Well, I mean, it depends upon where the gene is sourced from. There was been a couple of interesting examples. One of the early experiments that were done were trying to raise the level of sulfur amino acids in grains. And there were a number of researchers that were involved in doing this, and they took a protein or gene, they encoded a protein from Brazil nut, which had 30% sulfur amino acids, which you know, we're dependent upon from our diet. And one of the first things they discovered that this was the key allergen in Brazil nuts. So if you shoved this into anything else, you'd make anybody who was allergic to Brazil nuts going to be allergic to that. So clearly that was not a good way to go. And that was dropped like a hot potato, as you can imagine.
But I think that's where the regulatory system comes into play, because you have to run those sort of tests before things are released and address those questions. What is the potential for allergenicity? What are the potential impacts on human health and safety? And not just from the gene tech regulations, but from food standards. You must provide substantial information to support your case as to why they should be entered into the food chain.
I've got a quick comment question over here. So I'm over here. I just wanted to see what you look like to the rest of the group, and you guys look adequate. No, you're doing really well. You're certainly from the waist down.
Sorry, I've been waiting to raise a point about, I think it was Tony who brought up the comparison between GM tech, or rather genetic modification, genetic technology for producing therapeutic goods versus GM crops. I think there's a big difference. I have a biology background, and that's why I speak of it. I mean, in the case of therapeutic goods, we are only using the end product. It's the purified insulin or whatever else that you're consuming, whereas in the case of GM crops, we are talking about crops being out in the environment, and they are going to have a completely different, so it's not just the technology, but you know, the whole process and the fact that that technology is going to remain in the environment, whereas bacteria that produce insulin are not just left floating around here and there. They are produced in a safe, contained facility, and you only use the end product of it.
But there are some analogies there when, I mean, most of the activities that some of these guys will undertake occur within containment facilities that are certified by the regulator to meet a certain standard for containment. And if they want to then intentionally release them into the environment and run a field trial to address some of the risk issues that may come up in terms of how it might perform in the environment, not just how it performs as a crop, but also how it performs in terms of its environmental safety. That's what the regulatory system does. And that's why Peter raised that it costs a significant amount of money to get through those hoops or those hurdles to get something to market, because you need to satisfy and tick all those boxes to show that you have addressed risks and that they do fall below the levels by which we as society have deemed to be satisfactory.
That's exactly what I was saying, that they need to be marking the end effect of GM crops is quite different to the end product of GM foods.
Depends on the GM crop. I mean, GM canola, in many cases, the oil is analogous to the insulin. Yep.
Sure. I think we get ourselves back to process again. Now we're desperately out of time. I've got lots of people who are important making signals at me, and most of them aren't very pleasant. I would show you that that's offensive to me too, by the way, if you're wondering. Anyway, quickly, it occurred to me, Peter, we never asked you what made you feel wonderful, I don't think. Did you have anything? Is there anything that makes you feel great?
I actually think a really good sleep.
Fair enough.
Sleep is undervalued. How many people here actually recall some of the really great sleeps of their life?
I do.
Yes, I do as well.
I'm actually planning one on the weekend.
So sleep is really great.
And Carl?
My two boys. Spending time with my two boys is just... There's nothing that beats time with your kids.
Really?
Because we looked at the plant breeding scenario where you're the product of hang on, you're the product of your parents, right? And you look at your parents and you go, there are some really good things I like about them, there's some really bad things about them. But the great thing about breeding is that the progeny is usually better than the parents. So I like to look at my kids and see the things that I think, oh, they get that from me, or the things that they themselves, they're unique and makes them better than I am. I love that.
I think it's awesome. I'm not sure my parents would agree with you.
And you can play your partner.
There was a door prize tonight, by the way, or more importantly, an ask prize. I believe that underneath somebody's backside, somewhere in this room, if you look under your chair, there should be something on someone's chair which entitles you to a life supply of chocolate frogs. I don't know, what's it for? What's the prize? $100. It's for $100 voucher for here. Right, okay. That's it. No, it's made in Indonesia. That's not the same thing. Sorry, where? Where is it? Yes! Excellent. Raise your hand and wave a bit of paper around. Oh, look proud about it. It's a bug. It's a bug. Yeah, lovely. And if you do the math, you think yourself, how much of this can you get for $100? You're going to be living like a queen, madam. Okay, I'm going to ask the panel here to give us some final thoughts. As they're doing that, I need you to do something very important for me. If you're observant people, and I think you probably are, there are these placemats on your tables. They're not actually placemats, so if you've spilled on food on them, that's all really gross of you. This is really useful information for us. It tells us something about what your brain has been doing throughout this conversation. They're very simple questions, and we'd love you to just put a mark on the line there for us. The results of this, by the way, will be compiled. We will put it on the forum. It'll be online, so I'll be able to access that information in the next day or so. Is that reasonable? We'll try and get it up during the networking session afterwards if we can. It is very simple. It is very important. And you only get there's a pen inside your bags, by the way. There's also a nice pen inside your bag, as well as the ones on the table. So if you haven't got enough pens, then you're not looking hard enough. Just quickly, I might get a final comment from our panelists because they're still here while you're doing that. I guess, Alex, these people are being asked to vote on how they feel about GM compared to when they first walked into the room in terms of foods. Have you had? I guess a better question is, where do you see the future is? I mean, you're someone whose future depends upon this stuff going in a useful direction, and yet you must have an influence over that as well. What do you think the future is for GM in food?
Where do I see the future for GM in food? I think I see increasing application beyond what we initially saw, which has primarily been herbicide and pesticide tolerance. I think we're going to see a lot more other traits, such as nutrition just being one of them. So I see an expanding role for it in food, and I think also with climate change coming in with elevated CO2, there's going to be big impacts on plants out in the field, and I think GM can possibly help with that and play a big role with that.
Thank you. Rob, any thoughts on where GM sits in answer to our big question, which is about food security?
Look, I just want to encourage people to ask a larger set of questions than about a particular crop and its benefits. To consider questions about the impact on accessibility, to consider questions about how you are situated in relation to these crops and these decisions. Obviously, food security is a good thing. I'd be very surprised if some modified crops didn't have some role to play. I'm also pretty worried about the time frame for some of these things. I suspect that we might be looking at too little too late in the face of climate change. So maybe that's a reason for looking at some non-technological solutions. If the situation really is as urgent in terms of climate change as it's starting to look at the moment, we don't have 14 years to wait before a new crop comes onto the market. And that would suggest that maybe some of the low-tech alternatives are worth looking at the same time.
Sure. Peter?
Yeah, if you look at the predictions for global food security and the problems that we're facing, I think particularly in the face of climate change, the issues related to land degradation, all the rest of it, it's very easy to paint an extremely bleak scenario. And ultimately, improving the yields of our crops is a temporary measure. The key things in ensuring global food security are probably ultimately going to be education, population control, and those sorts of things. These technologies that we talked about today, including GM, which I think is going to be an important component of what happens, are essentially technologies that may buy us some time. But unless we tackle the more fundamental problems that we're facing, I think as a race, it's only going to buy us time, and we will be doomed.
That's a wonderful message. Folks, when you've got those evaluations, you hold them in the air and wave them around.
Sorry.
We have feedback fairies swimming around. They need to get the ones that are filled out, not the blank ones. So hold them up. Be proud of your head and stuff. Carl, final thoughts on food security and what GM can do to fix everything.
I just think there are a couple of things. One is that I think it's great that the people that are here have taken the time to come and attend a session like this to either on the one hand learn something or to at least get informed and to get involved, and I think that's very, very important. But the second point is that whilst here in Australia, in reality we have things pretty damn good, to think that food security is not, whilst we start off talking about it being very much a local issue, food security is very much a global issue, and I think some of the questions that are being raised by my colleagues here about those other issues, I think they're the things that we really need to, as a society, be discussing, and what role Australia would play in the global sense.
I suspect you're right. Now, folks, we are pretty much out of time. We need to acknowledge some very important people that have done very important stuff for us. One of those is, of course, the Australian Centre for Plant and Functional Genomics, who have put in on this little shindig, but they would have been putting on a pretty ordinary shindig, frankly, if it were not for some funding from National Science Week, which actually starts on the weekend. But the bottom line is the ACPFG is so far ahead of the game that they're even ahead of Science Week. There is Science Week process around, and there's loads of stuff. I expect to see you guys at lots of different events. I expect to see you at the Expert Hotel tomorrow night at 8 o'clock. I'll be looking out for you individually. And also a big thank you to Tech and You, who are administering most of this debate. They're also getting the forum online, and they're providing an information service for people like you who are interested in knowing more about this stuff and having a say. And Carl is dead right. The biggest thank you of all must go to you guys for coming out, engaging in a conversation, asking good questions, having thoughts, and making sure that that kind of mentality is being pursued generally in the community. So thank you all for coming out.
And ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for Krishna-Pillay, our host tonight.